Africa's pro-poor budget could not have been better received, even if it had been delivered by Robin Hood himself. A clear highlight for insurers and other industry in Finance Minister Pravin Gordhan's now trillion-rand budget speech is the massive increase in infrastructure spending. With us here in studio to discuss the budget, as well as the impact of US sanctions against Iran a little later, is independent political analyst, futurist and keynote speaker Daniel Silke. Daniel, in your new book, Tracking the Future, Top Trends That Will Shape South Africa and the World, did you earmark the huge growth potential in Africa as a trend that will put South Africa and Africa on the map?
Yes. In fact, I have a whole chapter devoted to Africa and the bullish nature of investing in Africa, certainly for the next 30, 40, 50 years to 2050. I'm very excited about Africa. And if you look at the prospects for the next 5 to 10 years, and we look at which countries in the world are going to grow the fastest, out of the top 10 countries, number 1 and number 2 will be China and India, 7 out of the remaining 8 countries are going to be African countries. And we're going to see tremendous growth coming out of Congo, coming out of Ghana in particular, from Nigeria, all growing at 6, 7, 8, 9% per annum to a degree. And I think Africa really is becoming the final frontier, in a sense, globally for investment. Commodities, obviously, it's got a growing middle class and a growing consumer base to it for the first time. And I do extensively deal with that in my book as a critical trend going forward. It's pretty good news for us, in fact.
Where does South Africa fit into this positive growth story?
Yes, it's a good question, because South Africa itself is not going to grow at the same growth rates as Africa. South Africa is only going to grow, well, we know what the projections are now from Minister Gordhan at 2.7%, well, let's say 2.7 to 3% for the next year or so. Projections are 3 to 4% perhaps for 2013, 2014. But we are growing at a substantially different pace to Africa. Now, this means that other African countries can often be seen as more exciting investment destinations than South Africa. We always assume in this country that we are the leader of the pack and that we're a conduit or an entry point into the African continent. But if Ghana is going to grow at 6 or 7% per annum, if Nigeria, as long as there aren't too many political problems, grow at 6 or 7% per annum, investors may look at going directly into these other African countries rather than necessarily coming via this country. So I am perhaps a little concerned that South Africa's growth rates are certainly not up there with those African success stories going forward. And I think that places extra pressure on the South African government to be that much more competitive from a global point of view. And that's the era that we're going into. That's one of the key trends that I talk about in my book. And generally, it's how competitive the world is on every single issue. And for South Africa, in Africa, our competition is coming from across our borders.
What do you think Pravin Gordhan should have done to fuel investment growth in South Africa?
Well, it's interesting. If you have a look to see how South Africa is perceived internationally as an investment destination within Africa, it ranks very highly. Foreign investors, corporate heads, polled recently in a survey, really like South Africa as an investment destination. So the perception about South Africa is positive. But when it comes to actual investment figures into the country, South Africa simply doesn't get that level of investment. It doesn't match the positive perception of the country. So clearly we are doing something wrong in terms of encouraging foreign investment. What I certainly think is we need a holistic vision in South Africa. It's not just about tax breaks for companies or export processing zones, which there is now some talk about. It's going to be fleshed out, I think, over the course of the next year or so, to encourage key industries to establish themselves in parts of South Africa. It's about an entire review of red tape within South Africa. It's about a review of labor legislation in particular in South Africa to make the country that much more attractive. It's about reviewing our Department of Home Affairs inability to efficiently attract skills into South Africa and process those skills. If we're going to invest in infrastructure to the tune of nearly R1 trillion, as proposed in the budget, we are going to need vast skills coming into this country. And we are going to need a much more efficient government framework in order to welcome people into the country and those skills. We've actually held those skills out of South Africa, and now we've got to find those skills and bring them back home, in a sense. I think government is aware of this. I think we've seen interesting moves from government to say, look, we are going to need engineers in South Africa to accomplish all we want to do. We know that South African engineers have left the country over the course of the last 10 years. We are going to try and find ways now to bring those engineers back to South Africa. And it's a holistic vision for the country.
Well, the focus on infrastructure development is certainly welcomed by insurers and other industries because it means more business for them. But it comes at a time when slowed growth is expected. Where will the funding come from?
Look, I think everybody wants infrastructure. So without a doubt, in order to make us more globally competitive, infrastructure and an increased spend on infrastructure, particularly for a commodity-rich country like South Africa, is critical to take us to the next level of growth. So I'm very happy that there's a concentration on infrastructure. Of course, infrastructure needs to go hand in hand again with a variety of other incentives, which we've already spoken about. It's all very well having the infrastructure, but is the regulatory framework in South Africa conducive? Will it assist? Once we've spent the money on infrastructure, will we be efficient from a regulatory point of view to attract that foreign investment? Will our labor laws also allow a degree of enthusiasm from outsiders to come into South Africa? And I think that's an important issue. What we do know is that we have been hamstrung in South Africa from developing our commodity industry, our mining industry, because of a lack of adequate infrastructure, because we haven't got the rail lines, we can't transport the goods. And as a result, South Africa's standing in terms of being an attractive destination for investment in the mining sector has in fact fallen over the last decade or so. It's improved recently, but we know we've been hamstrung by poor infrastructure. So one can only welcome it. I might add, it's also politically very popular, the issue of infrastructure. Everybody wants infrastructure, from the business community, from the insurance sector, from the trade unions because they're jobs, from the South African Communist Party. All members of the alliance and the broader South Africa are patriotic about the notion of infrastructure. So it's an easy political sell for the ANC as well.
While everyone may want infrastructure, will consumers have to carry the cost, so negatively impacting their disposable income?
Now, I don't think that the spend on infrastructure specifically is going to impact upon the consumer. I think that government has a fair amount of cash in its coffers. It is budgeted for the nearly 900 million rand on these large infrastructure projects, the specific ones that President Zuma announced in his State of the Nation address. It's budgeted for, it's there. I think that we've got a relatively manageable debt to GDP ratio in South Africa, at anywhere between 35 to 40%. Now, in Greece, that debt to GDP ratio is in fact well over 100%. That's why the country is in a degree of liquidation, if you want to use that particular term. So we've got room to maneuver in terms of spending on these large projects. I think there are questions one can ask about the efficiency of spend on these projects and whether the capacity of government to deliver a World Cup style management team, which really got us all the lovely stadia efficiently, can that also be applied in South Africa? And if it can, then I don't think we're going to drain the consumer of further cash. I do think, though, that there is going to be a squeeze on the consumer. And that squeeze is going to come primarily, I think, from two sources. One, from the increase in the fuel price. Now, the fuel price increase is going to, we know tensions in the Middle East across the board are adding to that. And also, the fuel levy increase in the budget now of over 20 cents a litre really is a little bit like a VAT by stealth. It's a widespread tax. Everyone in South Africa suddenly will feel another 20 cents per litre. The transportation industry, the taxi industry, poor people will be affected by this. That will squeeze discretionary spend in South Africa. I think, too, if I might add, that discretionary spend is going to be curtailed to some degree by higher food prices. And we are going to see in South Africa the continuation of this global trend of higher food prices. So that's where the consumer, I think, is going to be squeezed more than on us paying necessarily for infrastructure. But of course, some of these indirect taxes also go to spending on big government projects like the National Healthcare Insurance Scheme that has been announced. And there's an overhaul of that coming, and somebody's going to have to pay for that. And the minister specifically warned in the budget, and it's the second year that he's done this, he's warned that we might well see in future a general VAT increase in order to pay for certainly the national healthcare insurance scheme. So I think when planning your business for the next few years, take into account that the very positive trends that we've seen up until now in terms of consumer spend in South Africa may well be adjusted, I think, and we might well see consumers really squeezed on these issues going into this year, despite the very good results that we've seen of most of South Africa's retailers, for that matter, over the course of the last few months.
Now, before we chat about fuel, let's talk regulation. Is it positive, or does it push up costs across the board, as is seen in the financial services sector in the cost of compliance, and does it discourage investment?
I think a global trend is regulation. And if there's one trend that I talk about all the time when I do my presentations on the world, it really is regulation, regulation, and regulation. Now, this is not something that's specific to South Africa. It's something specific to the entire world. And it's partially as a result of the economic crisis and meltdown over the last 2 years, where clearly financial regulations now are at center stage of government policy. And I think, too, in South Africa, that because the ANC alliance essentially is an alliance that would err on the side of promoting more regulation, especially from the state, we are likely to see more of a shift towards regulation. But I'm not particularly perturbed about what we may well see in terms of government intervention on this particular issue. If you go back and look at our banking sector in South Africa, our financial services sector in general in South Africa over the last few years, our services sector rank amongst the top 10 jurisdictions globally in terms of their efficiency, their effectiveness, in terms of transparency and accountability. We are in the top 10 globally. Now, that's because, in a sense, we did introduce a quite efficient regulatory environment. It might not have satisfied all those who want a laissez-faire kind of economy, but we did introduce that over the course of the last few years prior to the global financial crisis and meltdown. And that protected our financial services industry to a great degree from some of the many shocks that the US or UK markets found. So in a sense, whilst I myself personally am not a proponent of regulation, I've become a little more accepting of how it's been applied in South Africa and how it has stood us in excellent stead to be a competitive global player from the financial services point of view. And again, our financial services industry, one of the top performers on global rankings. We position South Africa compared to other countries in the world. Look at the World Competitiveness Report and see where South Africa ranks on its financial services sector. Really pretty impressive stuff in the top 10 globally. So on that score, I think I'm very happy. I'm not always that happy when it comes to government delivery, but in terms of private sector delivery, we've really been very good.
Could regulation be improved?
I think we need clarity on regulation, and no business wants a fuzzy grey area on regulation. And that's something that we certainly need from government here. Absolute clarity and a medium to longer term vision so that business can really adapt over a period of time. Shocks to the system are really something that hampers business. And we need to be absolutely aware of that. And we need to also be aware of what our competitors are doing in terms of regulation. We need to be aware of what an island nation like Mauritius is doing in terms of locking in a financial sector to be a sort of a conduit into Africa. And we need to look to see what policies they've introduced to make their investment potential a lot more attractive. So again, on regulation, we also need to understand the global competitiveness environment of that. And we need to learn those lessons from best practice and what not to do from worst practice for that matter.
2012 may bring us the apocalypse after all. In order to force the world's third largest oil producer to open up its nuclear projects for inspection, the US strengthened sanctions against Iran last December and has promised to come down hard on countries and companies that continue to deal with Iran. Hence the EU's prompt embargo of Iranian oil in January. Between 25 and 30% of South Africa's oil comes from Iran, making us one of 3 countries that heavily reliant on Iranian crude. The Department of Energy recently told the media that the majority of South Africa's privately owned refineries are geared to only process Iranian crude, and that modifying these to handle oil from elsewhere would cost hundreds of millions and take months, if not years, all the while disrupting our fuel supply. We have until end June to comply. Daniel, South Africa has to stop importing oil from Iran and may not be able to comply by deadline. How strict will the US be? Do we face exclusion from the US financial system?
Well, I think the short answer is we actually really don't quite know at this stage as to whether the US will go all out in excluding us, as you have alluded to. My own personal view is that South Africa finds herself in a very difficult position. She has had historic links with Iran politically, but at the same time, South Africa clearly wants to be seen to be on the side of the United States, especially in terms of South Africa's desire to secure a permanent seat at the United Nations Security Council. So the country, South Africa, really has to trade off her historic ties with Iran and also her desire to be part of the broad agreement within the United Nations that can secure Africa and South Africa a seat at the UN. And I think South Africa is going to essentially be forced to do the best it can to comply with these sanctions. Now, whether or not the country would be liable for capital expenditure on its own if it had to modify its refinery process to refine Saudi crude, or take the 30% slack, whether it comes from Saudi or whether it comes from Qatar, whether or not the United States would provide some sort of assistance or from a fund for countries to do this, South Africa might well get that kind of assistance down the line. And we just don't quite know yet how that's going to pan out. My own view is that the country, South Africa, will need to comply where possible, where practically possible, it will need to comply, and I think that we will go some way to, in fact, excluding Iranian oil imports from this country, and we will make the necessary modifications to do that. Again, who's going to foot the bill? I think that will be up for negotiation. South Africa, really, from a foreign policy point of view, has been very ambiguous on its position regarding Iran, and I think, again, the political trade-offs that are involved here is making this an extremely sensitive issue for the country, and one that really could cause, again, the domestic fuel price in South Africa to rise. In fact, given some of your earlier questions, the issue of passing on costs to the consumer could further be exacerbated as a result of South Africa being forced to outlay capital expenditure to refine non-Iranian crude.
Do you think that South Africa's relationship with Iran is one that needs to be more closely examined?
I think that South Africa is behind the scenes being pressured to become more proactive in terms of its stance on Iran. It's a little bit similar to South Africa's position on some of the other major international issues of late, including the issue on Libya, where South Africa was ambiguous on Libya up to a point, and then supported the UN resolution, but with many reservations. Now, I think we've seen the same from a political point of view. We're seeing the same uncertainty at a foreign policy level coming out of the South African government on how exactly to play this issue. But again, when push comes to shove on a global issue like this, and despite South Africa's historic sympathy, perhaps, towards the Iranian government and the close business ties that do exist, particularly on the issue of importation of oil for that matter, I think South Africa will go with the global international community on applying the necessary sanctions where practically possible.
Thank you for joining us in studio, Daniel.
No, thank you. It's been a pleasure to be here. I hope to see you again.